What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another fantasy video. Today we have the wide receiver stardom sit-ems of week 5. As we get into our first game here, I want you guys to keep in mind that this is for PPR formats. That's points per reception. So just keep that in mind. Now, for stardom sit-em this week, I've got the Bills and the Jaguars. Stephon Diggs is a definite start. He's the number 5 receiver in fantasy. They have a high-powered offense, and he averages 10 targets, 8 catches a game to go along with 100 yards, and he's gotten a couple touchdowns. He's a definite start. As for Christian Kirk and Calvin Ridley, it was kind of a toss-up for me. I decided to start Christian Kirk. He's been stepping up a lot in the turmoil that Ridley's struggled with. He's been targeted 32 times to 17 for Ridley over the last couple of weeks. He's got 18 points per game for the last 3 weeks, and with Tre'Davious White out, the number 1 corner, or now number 2, turned into number 1 corner, should be on Ridley, which puts Kirk up against a better matchup. Ridley, he's struggled a lot. He's got a bad case of the dropsies, including multiple touchdown drops. Over the last 3 games, he's averaged 2 catches in under 40 yards. To go along with Buffalo allowing the 9th least fantasy points per game allowed to wide receivers, so I don't think he has a very good matchup here, and I would sit him until he can prove himself again. As for our next game, we've got the Falcons and the Texans. First off, we're going to start Nico Collins. He's the number 1 receiver for Stroud. There's no questioning it. He's proven his consistency. He had 1 bad game, but he's been targeted 9 times in 3 out of 4 games. He has 3 touchdowns in the last 3, and he's averaging over 20 points per game this season. As for Tank Dell, I would sit him. He's got 2 good weeks, 2 bad weeks, but he's still listed as number 3 on the depth chart, even behind Robert Woods. I think his performances have been pretty misleading as far as like his fantasy value. Atlanta also allows the 3rd least receiving yards per game to wide receivers in the NFL with just 115, so he's pretty boom or bust. He's just too inconsistent for me. That's why I'm going to sit him. And I'm going to sit the entire Atlanta receiving core. They have no passing offense. They're the worst in the NFL, and Desmond Ridder is bad. He just kind of is terrible right now. He's struggling a lot. The Texans allow the 4th least fantasy points per game to receivers. And they've only allowed 1 touchdown to receivers. So Texans are not too shabby themselves until the Falcons can figure out whatever is going on with their offense besides Bijan. You're just going to want to sit pretty much everybody else. There's no questioning it. Next, we've got the Lions versus the Panthers. First, we're going to start Adam Thielen. He's averaging 10 targets over the last 3 games with 8 receptions and 90 yards per game. He's the number 10 wide receiver in fantasy currently, and he amounts to about a 4th of the target share in the Carolina offense, which is quite a lot. As for the Detroit wide receivers, I initially had St. Brown as a must-start, but since then, he's been ruled pretty much out or doubtful. The other wide receivers are too inconsistent, and they're dealing with injuries / suspensions. Jameson Williams was told he was going to be on a snap count. With no certainties in the passing offense, it's really hard to pick one out, and Carolina's pass defense has been pretty good this year, 6th least in the entire NFL, so I would just avoid all of Detroit's wide receivers to begin with. Colts and Titans are up next. We're going to want to start Michael Pittman. The Titans allow the 6th most points per game to wide receivers at just under 44. Pittman's got the 5th most receiving yards in the NFL. He's averaging 10 targets a game with 6 catches, and with Jonathan Taylor coming back, or pretty much having been confirmed to come back since I recorded this, it should allow a lot more of the passing lanes to open because he could be a focal point. As for DeAndre Hopkins, the Colts do allow a lot of points per game to the wide receiver. However, the Titans have the 5th worst passing offense in the NFL, and he's currently ranked 47th in fantasy for wide receiver. There's plenty of better options to go with here. The Titans are just too inconsistent in the passing game to trust DeAndre Hopkins, and I can't see any real good reason to start him this week. The Dolphins and the Giants are up next. This one's pretty simple. You're going to want to start Tyreek and Jalen Waddle. Their offense is super explosive, number 1 offense in the entire NFL. The Giants give up 3rd most total points per game. This is going to be the easiest defense that Waddle has faced so far, so even though he's kind of been when he has played, it should be really easy against the Giants. It's just too good for them both not to start. As for the Giants, the same thing with the Falcons. Until this offense can prove something, you just need to sit them. Their O-line is terrible, and the Giants, even if they could develop routes or get open, they don't have any time because Daniel Jones is just under duress the entire time. There's too many targets being shared around this offense, so you never know who's going to get targeted at what time, and for that reason, the Giants are just avoided at all costs. And up next, we have the Patriots versus the Saints. Now, I was kind of tempted to lean to sit Olave, and that's only because Derek Carr is hurt. Last week, in Derek Carr's injury, he only had 6 targets and 1 catch. He can make explosive plays, and he's averaged 100 yards per game with 8 catches the first 3 weeks. But we saw what happened with Derek Carr last week in his injury, and Kamara became basically the entire offense. So if that becomes the case again, he's going to probably struggle, and for that reason, I'm leaning him starting. But it's a slight lean. It could go very bad for him. As for the Patriots wide receivers, Mac Jones is struggling heavily. He's only thrown 1 touchdown and 2 picks in the last 2 weeks, 75 yards per game with 13 completions averaged over those 2 games, and no wide receiver is currently averaging over 45 yards per game total. So the Patriots' passing attack is just dreadful. Until they can figure it out, Juju and all those guys, they should just be avoided at all costs. There's no point in playing them. I'm sure there are tons of better options. Next up, we have an interesting one in a divisional matchup between the Steelers and the Ravens. I was tempted to put Zay Flowers in the sick category, but the Steelers are just struggling right now. They've got the 7th worst pass defense in the NFL, and Lamar is building rapport with him. They also allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to wide receiver. Zay Flowers is getting consistent volume and production. He's getting a bunch of first downs, keeping drives alive, and for that reason, I'm going to lean him toward the start. As for George Pickens, the quarterback situation in Pittsburgh is a struggle. We don't know if it's Trubisky or Pickett, and either way, I don't care. They're both pretty bad. The Ravens have the number 3 pass defense in the NFL, and Pickens is only averaging about 4 catches and 60 yards per game right now. They've got the 8th worst pass offense in the entire NFL, and we've got to let them figure it out before we even think about starting Pickens again this season. For some reason in this game, I feel like it's going to be a really high-scoring game. The Cardinals and the Bengals. Jamar Chase, he's going to be a definite start. You should never sit him. He's always freaking open, according to him. He's the number 1 receiver. He's got a great matchup. It's as simple as that. Start him. Marquise Brown and Michael Wilson. Marquise Brown is getting consistent work. He's got 10 targets in 2 of the last 3 games. He's playing really well, and he's pretty undervalued, especially because he's been averaging 17 fantasy points per game over the last 3 weeks. And the Bengals can't really seem to figure it out quite yet. They're kind of getting there, but they're not quite there yet, especially with Burrow being hurt. So I think this is a good matchup for him. Michael Wilson, I'm sitting him only because I need his usage to go up a little bit. I need to see what else he can do. He had a great game last week, but he needs to get more usage and have more volume. So right now you should stash him and let him simmer while he can keep proving that he can be consistent in this offense. Up next, we have what is probably a lot of people's fantasy-wise game of the week. We've got Philadelphia and the Rams. You're going to want to start both of these receiving cores. Philadelphia is being Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown is averaging 150 yards, 9 catches over those last 2 weeks. He's the number 9 fantasy receiver right now. Smith is number 15 himself in fantasy. Both are mainstays. You should start them because they're really good. They're above the league average, and the Eagles' offense is just really, really good. The Rams wide receivers, I did not include Tutu Atwell because Kupp is back. So Kupp and Puka, I'm still going to start both. Puka is setting the world on fire right now. He's the number 5 wide receiver in PPR fantasy. He's the number 2 wide receiver in total receiving yards. He has the most targets in the NFL. Philly allows 36.5 fantasy points per game to wide receivers, which is the 6th most. And for Cooper Kupp, he's him. Like, let's be honest. Cooper Kupp, former offensive player of the year. He broke records. He's that guy. And especially with Matt Stafford, he is that guy. And he was told to not be on a snap count. So with all of those factors going, you need to start all of these guys. Next up, we have the Broncos versus the Jets. For Garrett Wilson, you're going to want to start him. Zach Wilson is coming off probably his best career pro game. Garrett Wilson had 9 catches and 14 targets last week, and he can only go up from here. Broncos are dead last in 3 of the 4 major defensive categories, and Garrett Wilson will not get a better matchup than this. He has to be started, and there's just no way you don't start him. As for the Broncos wide receivers, I'm going to sit them, which is pretty shocking, I know, but the ball is being spread around this offense a lot, and I'm not really sure who to trust in this offense. The Jets allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers as well, and they're known to be a difficult secondary to go up against. I would avoid these wide receivers unless you don't have any better options but to play them. Otherwise, it's just too inconsistent that I just don't trust anybody on the Broncos right now to do anything for me. Vikings versus Chiefs is a very interesting matchup up next. I don't know about you, but I'm going to want to start Justin Jefferson. It's almost like he's possibly the best wide receiver in football right now and the number 1 fantasy receiver. If you aren't starting him, I really don't know what you're doing. As for the sits, you're going to want to sit Jordan Addison. The Chiefs have allowed just 23 fantasy points per game average to wide receivers. That's the 8th least in the NFL. He's given a lot of opportunities, but it seems like he was more of a boom or bust play and very touchdown dependent in order to be fantasy relevant. So if he doesn't get that really big play, it just doesn't work out for him. As for the Chiefs, you don't really know who their number 1 receiver is. The number 1, technically, receiver with the most yardage is Justin Watson, and he only has 163 yards per game in 4 yards total in 4 games. Each wide receiver is averaging 5 targets or under per game, and nobody has consistent volume in this offense except for Travis Kelce, so you should just avoid every single Chiefs receiver. Next up, we have what is actually the game of the week in the NFL, the 49ers versus the Cowboys. You're going to want to go ahead and start CeeDee Lamb. He's the number 15 receiver in fantasy, and that's with 2 blowout victories. So he's getting really good usage, even in the blowouts. The 49ers have the 3rd best rush defense in the NFL, which should force Dallas to throw the ball a lot more, which provides a lot more opportunities for CeeDee Lamb to cook. Brandon Ayuk, you're going to want to start. Dallas defense is kind of untested. They played Zach Wilson, Daniel Jones, Josh Dobbs. They just haven't played very good quarterbacks, to be honest with you. So it's kind of interesting to see. They face struggling offenses, and the 49ers have probably one of the most consistent offenses in the entire league, which should allow Brandon Ayuk to get plenty of opportunities. When he is on the field, he's the clear number 1 receiver. He averages 6 catches and 100 yards per game in the 3 games that he played so far. So I would look at Ayuk to make big plays. I'm going to want to sit Deebo Samuel this week. I know it's a risky play and a lot of people want it, but just him playing can be very risky. He can definitely score over 20 points per game, but Ayuk should see more volume, and he's dealing with some injuries, so he's possibly going to be used more as a decoy than a focal point in this offense. So I would avoid Deebo for the time being until we see just how much his usage is going to be limited because of those injuries. And last up, we have the Monday Night Football game, the Raiders versus the Packers. I actually think this is going to be a decently high-scoring game. I'm going to want to start all 3 of these receivers. I didn't include Christian Watson because He's still coming back from injury, and I'm not really sure what to do with him. So I put Dobbs on here. He's been targeted 25 times in the last 2 weeks by Love. He's the number 17 wide receiver in fantasy football right now. The Raiders give up about 30 points per game to receivers, and the Packers' O-line is hurt. That should lead to an ineffective run game, which they've already been experiencing, and that should allow more opportunities for Romeo Dobbs to shine. As for Jacoby Myers, Devontae Adams, and the Raiders receiving core, you're going to want to start both these guys. Jimmy G is coming back. Jacoby Myers has had 16 catches and 22 targets with Jimmy G as quarterback. He gets a lot of volume, which is pretty important in these PPR leagues where points pile up every catch. They're not big yard. He's not a big yardage guy, but he does get a lot of catches, and that adds up very quickly. Devontae Adams, this is his revenge game. He's going back to. He's going to play against the Packers. He's targeted 50 times in the first 4 weeks, which is the second most in the NFL. He's the number 6 wide receiver in fantasy. He's had 33 targets over the last 2 weeks. Devontae Adams is Devontae Adams. If he's not being started, you're in the wrong league. You have the wrong players. He should be started, and so should the other two. And that'll do it for this week's Stardom Sit-em with the wide receivers. I just wanted to take this time to thank you guys all for checking out my channel. I've had quite a lot of growth since I actually started uploading these videos already, so I'm glad to see that you guys enjoy them. If you guys like these videos and want to see more of them, make sure you smash that subscribe button, like, comment. I love giving fantasy advice. I love talking to people about fantasy advice, so if that's something that you guys are interested in, make sure you guys are commenting down below, giving me your opinions and everything. Would love to hear them. Other than that, I thank you guys for checking out my video, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Peace.